Ukraine cannot win its war against Russia. Now, you've heard me categorically say that quite a number of times if you've been watching our channel at any for any distance or any amount of time. And very often, in fact, usually I'll sit there and I'll show you based on current events what's been going on and why that is. But I want to share with you on a deeper level today to drive home why I can say that with such confidence and such certainty about the outcome, because it's obviously very critical for American policymakers, especially to understand, and the American people. And one of the reasons we love having this channel is because we have a chance to go directly to the people and bypass a lot of the official statements that come out of our government, who rarely tell the truth, or certainly not the full truth. But you're going to get that today. Now, a lot of people know, and we actually did a show on this a couple of days ago, that the 24th of February was the 2-year mark of the Russia-Ukraine war. Well, today actually is the 33rd anniversary of another important battle that has interesting ramifications for this, the Russia-Ukraine war here, and that is the Battle of 7-3 Easting. And in 1991, I, along with Doug McGregor, who you've seen on this channel a lot, very often, along with thousands of other troopers from the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. That's me on the left of the picture there with the mustache. I know it looks pretty strange. My wife still wishes I could airbrush it out of the picture, but that's a story for another day. That's me on top of what was a Bradley fighting vehicle that we configured to be able to act as a fire support vehicle. That's a laser designator there, just under my right arm there that I'm lifting up there. But this is from that time, and during that battle, there was several important things that we learned during that time that have a lot of ramifications for what happens in the armored battle that's going on here in Russia and Ukraine. And many of the fundamentals, even though one was in the desert and one is in the European terrain, there's a lot of similarities because there are a lot of fundamentals of things that underpin how combat power is made. And in fact, I mentioned here's a couple of other shots of so this was actually shortly after the Battle of 7-3 Easting. That's then Captain H.R. McMaster there next to me. That's his tank, he was basically the one of the heroes of the Battle of 7-3 Easting. He was later to be President Trump's national security advisor. And then, of course, as you know from many times here on our channel, Doug McGregor was the operations officer at that time. This is a picture I actually took of him on the 7-3 Easting, from which the battle is named. The Cougar 3 was his call sign. That's him on the left. You can see him in the turret, and that's his command center forward, Cougar forward, in the Bradley right behind it. And then here's a picture of Doug himself in front of his beloved tank. So when you hear him make a lot of these comments, that's another reason why you want to listen to him, because he knows what he's talking about. He's been there. He's done that. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about what the Battle of 7-3 Easting was exactly 33 years ago to this day in the northern part of Kuwait against the Iraqi Republican Guard. And then I'm going to tell you some of the key things that we learned which translate across any kind of domain. And then we're going to wrap it forward to why it matters for the Ukraine war and what you can expect to happen here going forward. So interesting thing about this. So Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August the 2nd of 1990. And initially, the president sent some 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne rapid reaction groups, which were basically just infantrymen, and they actually put them into Desert Act mainly as a tripwire, hoping that Saddam Hussein, with his armor, wouldn't move forward and put that to the test into Saudi Arabia, while he built up power with the U.S. Armored Corps that was stationed in Germany at the time. And the lead of that corps was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. That's what 2 ACR. That's what I was a part of. I was in the 2nd Squadron of that organization, an Eagle Troop, as it turned out. Interesting thing, though, that we were on that day, on that very day, we were at the Grafenwehr training site preparing to do some field maneuvers against a Soviet force that was arrayed out there against us. It was a lot of live action, live fire. It was also maneuver warfare. It was a lot of the training going on back in those days. And all of the time we had been in there, about a year before we had deployed, we were all focused on a Russian/Soviet armored enemy. but it turned out to be the same basic equipment and gear that the Iraqis would use. So a lot of it translated over. Interesting, though, that all of our training had been in the area of Germany, and those kinds of European terrain and the forest, etc. Now we're going to be going to fighting in the desert. So you think that it would be dramatically different. But as we found out, it wasn't all that much different. Even though the terrain is different, the fundamentals of armored warfare are very, very similar. What happened in that battle was that in the northern part of Kuwait, the Iraqi Republican Guards had dug in, and they had several outposts in their front line of defense. The armored corps that I mentioned here, they were composed of the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions. That was going to be the big armored fist that was going to try to penetrate those lines. And so they had the cavalry. The 2nd Armored Cavalry was designed to be the eyes and ears of the corps commander, and they would be going in first. And of that group, the 2nd Squadron was at the lead of that. And of that, my troop was one of 2 that were at the forefront of the front. So we were literally the tip of the spear that was going in forward to get that. And by the way, in the description below on this video here, I've included a detailed series of articles I wrote some number of years back on the Battle of 7th Reaching, so you can go and get as much detail as you may want to get in that. But once we able to identify where the enemy was, then we fixed the enemy there in their dug-in positions, and we thrust through with H.R. McMaster, then famously led with tanks, because we had been leading with Bradley fighting vehicles and scout vehicles. If you saw the thumbnail for this episode right now, you see a black and white photograph of me in front of my fire support vehicle. It was a modified M113 vehicle with some targeting acquisition assets on the top of it, and a big hammerhead, they call it. And my driver, Michael Orth, there. Yeah, that's the one there. Thanks, Gary. So that was what I was in. So it was not quite as cool as a tank, but I was surrounded by the tanks and Bradleys. So that made me feel a lot better on the battlefield. But we had gone, my responsibility was to be forward with the lead element, so that once they started a direct fire engagement, I then would bring indirect fires with artillery and rocket fire on the next echelon of the enemy as the contact was made, to separate them from the battlefield so they couldn't flank us or bring reinforcements in from further back, which ended up how it was going to happen. But as the battle continued to unfold, the squadron led by Doug McGregor rolled up on those enemies. Instead of firing at them from a distance, we assaulted across the battlefield. They had dug in positions, which we caught them unawares and by surprise. Rolled across those positions and set up on the further side, so that we could then begin to lay a new line of defense, which is basically the 7-3 easting on a map grid, which is where the battle name comes from, and then continue to fire artillery and other long-range fires to isolate any other elements that may want to come. And then eventually the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions rolled through and continued all the way, pushing the Republican Guards back into Iraq. So that's kind of the gist of how that goes. So when I tell you, based on my experience, here's what I think happens in armored warfare. It's not theoretical. It's not just book knowledge. I've lived it. I've done it. I was also in the mid 2000s for the 1st Armored Division. I was the 2nd in command of an armored cav squadron myself, the 1st Squadron of the 1st Cavalry, which was then part of the 1st U.S. Armored Division in Germany, while they still had all their tanks and all that. So there's a lot of experience that goes on the ground with this. Now, also this weekend, the Breitbart did an article that it was an exclusive interview with me, in which I said that at the 2-year mark, there is no path to Ukrainian victory. And it's an extensive article. It's also linked in the comments below, or in the description below, so you can go and read that at your leisure there. But I'm going to now explain to you why I said that with such confidence at that time, and have continued on through, based on the lessons that we learned that were applicable across the board in our armored conflict in Desert Storm. And then I'm going to show you how that still applies directly to the conflict going on today, and why it's time for our leaders to recognize the same truth. The war is unwinnable, so stop pretending otherwise. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and you'll see graphically shortly. First of all, one of the things that really stood out is the unit cohesion. because our organization had been together as a regiment and our squadron for well over a year before we went into combat. So, we had our troops, we had our squadrons, and then the squadrons together made up the regiment. And we had done a lot of exercises, done computer exercises, we'd done field exercises, we'd done small unit training. We had gone out and done things in our local training areas even down to the crew level. Then we would come back up, and then we would do it at the large unit level. So we knew how each other was going to operate. We had done lots of training and lots of studying, even on other wars of the past and how armored conflicts in the Second World War had been fought. I saw somebody mention in the comments here something about the Battle of the Bulge, and that's one of the ones that I studied a great deal. The battles of Gazala Pass in North Africa in the desert during World War II with Erwin Rommel and the British Eighth Army, all of those kinds of things. We had all studied. I mean, McGregor specifically brought those battles into formal instructions in between going out and doing it. So we did the theoretical, then we did the practical. All of that took place a full year before we even deployed into Saudi Arabia to begin. Once we got on the ground there, then we actually expanded that to now transferring all the theory and the knowledge that we had gained to the ground, the new ground, in Saudi Arabia. And again, we did it at the platoon, the troop/company, squadron level, and then at the regimental level. So we were very cohesion before this thing kicked off. We knew who was on our left flank and who on our right flank. We knew what our job was. We had done gunnery and training to where we're experts on operating our weapon systems. Everybody was trained and ready to go. That was absolutely vital to our success on the battlefield on that day, because the Iraqi army didn't have it. They were actually inferior in nearly every capacity. So it was never a fair fight. But we could have beaten the best in the world at that time because we were that good and we were that well trained and that well led. The second thing is that it was experience at the key leader level. So our regimental commander had been a troop commander in Vietnam. So he had experience going all the way back to Vietnam at that time. And then our other leaders, and so he'd been in over 20 years even before that had happened. So he had lots of direct experience at commanding at all of the levels, all the way up there. So he knew what to do when things happened on the battlefield, and they did unexpectedly happen. Things changed. He already had so much experience of knowing what to do in any one of these situations. And when something shocking happened, he didn't give it a second thought. He just reacted to the next thing that happened. And the same is true at the squadron level. So you had the squadron commander who also had, I think, 17, 18 years of experience. Doug McGregor, as the operations officer, had about 15 years, I believe, at that time. The H.R. McMaster and the other troop commanders, they all had 5 to 7 years of experience commanding at the lower levels, of training, of going through command courses, all of those things. Every one of those was manned at the best level. All of our troops had individual training. When you take that kind of an organization that has that much cohesion, there's a great deal that you can do, and there's very little that you can't do. Now, then the next level was you take that level of capacity and human capacity within the equipment itself. So we had M1A1 tanks, we had the Bradleys, we had self-propelled howitzers, we had attack helicopters, scout helicopters, and then overhead we had access to Air Force, especially A-10s was one of the big things that we used. It was all of that was coordinated in together. Every aspect of that. So at the tank level, we had tank crewmen, we had tank mechanics. We were outfitted with all kinds of capacity and all the spare parts you could imagine, all the lubrications that you would need, all the replacement items, everything that you need to support M1s we had. We even had extra engines in our fleets. And then we had what they call depot level maintenance, which is the higher level. So even if something completely breaks down, we had the capacity right there to evacuate the vehicle and then fix it on site and then get it back into the fight. All of that was as trained and rehearsed and outfitted as much as the training for the actual combat had done. That was a big issue. Then the fourth part was the balance of power among the opponents. The difference between the U.S. and Iraq at that time was just off the charts in favor of the United States. So they didn't have that good of training. They certainly didn't have that good of equipment. It definitely wasn't maintained that well. and ours was the exact opposite on all of those. You put all that together, and it paints a picture that outcome was ordained. There was almost no chance that Iraq could even defend against us, much less to defeat our invading force. And as it turns out, that's exactly what happens. Now, every one of those are critical to assessing the balance of power between the Russian and the Ukraine side, and on the types of training that they have, because all of those things came to play, especially in last summer's offensive that the Ukraine tried to put together, and anything that they have that's going forward right now, because they're not going to be able to do that. The Ukraine side has lost so many people. This laughably low number of 31,000 that Zelensky said over the weekend that he admitted that they had lost is probably about a tenth of the actual number. It belies any kind of logic to suggest that their numbers are so low, when then simultaneously trying to claim that they've inflicted 500,000 casualties on the Russians, even though the Russians have them outgunned by 10 to 1 in some cases, 20 to 1 in certain locations on the battlefield. It belies any kind of common sense that the side with the massive firepower advantage is also going to be suffering 10 times the number of casualties. It's just not going to happen, and it didn't happen. So the truth is, Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of troops, killed and taken off the battlefield with serious wounds. That's the fact. And that has significant implications, because the amount of troops they have left have so little experience. They have so little specific individual training. They have virtually no training at the unit level. And they definitely don't have training at the combined arms level that is absolutely essential to driving Russia out of Ukraine. In fact, it's impossible without all of those things, like the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment had in Desert Storm. If you don't have your version of that there, you don't even have a prayer, and they don't. The Ukraine side doesn't have that. The equipment is a much bigger issue than what people want to understand and accept. In fact, it's just not common sense. That's not something that's intuitive that you can get just by being smart. So let me explain to you what that means. Ukraine got Challenger tanks from Britain. They got Leopards from Germany. They got M1s from the United States. They got AMX-10s from the United States, from France, rather. They got all kinds of different infantry fighting vehicles, again, from all different countries. There was quite a few others that came from different countries, and they all have different drivetrains. They all have different engines. They all have different spare part systems. And every one of these in the countries they come from have a very well coordinated and organized supply chain. They have a good maintenance system, like we did in Desert Storm, like the United States Army does today. Ukraine has none of that. And it is now becoming obvious. I made these comments in the spring of last year that this would afflict the Ukraine army, and now it is played out like that. And there was a report out just last week where the U.S., one of the inspector generals, actually, I don't remember if it was leaked or if they published it. I can't recall, but it is out there saying that the maintenance, especially at the depot level for the tanks and Bradleys, for many of the, especially the air defense systems, and the armored personnel carriers, it simply doesn't exist. And while they can make some small local repairs of some things, they don't, if they have the major repairs, they just don't have the ability to do that. That has led to as many vehicles, almost as many vehicles being taken out of action because of maintenance problems and the inability to get them operational, as from enemy losses. And if you can't repair what's broken down there, then every day you become weaker and weaker on the battlefield. And, to pretend that that's not going on, and then pretend that suddenly that they're going to be able to win that, when the Russian side does have those things. Now, they have very well chronicled logistics and supply problems, and for sure every army does, and Russia does as well. But in comparison, Russia's are far better, because all of these things are domestically produced. They don't have a hodgepodge from like half a dozen or dozen different countries of the same categories. They got one. They got one system, and it's based on what they themselves produce. So they have the ability to repair things that the Ukraine side doesn't have. Every way you want to look at this, the balance of power between the two, and especially going forward with the industrial capacity on the Russian side, continues to improve and get stronger by the day. And the one on the Ukraine side is just bumbling along. because Russia has long-range missiles, and the Ukraine has insufficient air defense, and they have continually knocked out their factories when they build new things, and they'll just never be able to catch up. That's the bottom line that you need to understand there. They're never going to be able to catch up off the battlefield, and that has direct ramifications on the battlefield. Now, then that brings me up to today. Where are we at right now? Now, all of these things that I've told you are well-known open source material information. Anyone who's willing to look at the facts as they are, who has any understanding of how combat power is made, how combat power at the unit level is produced and trained, the support, the maintenance, all of those kinds of things. If you understand that, and then you know what does exist on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine right now, then you know that there is no prospect to hope that suddenly things are just going to turn around because of a few dollars with it getting loose from the U.S. Congress this year, $60 billion. It's not a dollar figure that's the problem. It ain't the cash that's holding the Ukraine side back. It's all those fundamental things that I just told you about. And yet, what are our leaders saying today? So, first of all, let's take a look at Fiona Hill, former Trump administration official, who went on television yesterday and pointed a finger at that evil old Vladimir Putin and said, "We need to keep going." And here's what she said.
Putin thinks that he's winning because we've blinked, because we don't seem to have the courage, either politically or morally right now, to stand up and support Ukraine in fending him off and fending Russia off.
So it's just, those are bumper stickers. We don't have the courage. We're not willing to help them. We need more cash from the Congress, and we blinked. So like the issue is we blinked, whatever that actually means in practical terms. She doesn't explain that, nor attempt to, because that's a bumper sticker. But what does it mean there? Because all of those things I just told you that are very practical, graphic, that you can touch and put your hand on and make logic sense, that has nothing to do with anyone blinking or not blinking. It has to do with capacity, and they don't have it. So if your eyes are glued wide open or shut or blinking, whatever you want to talk, it's not going to change what happens on the battlefield. And I talk about this all the time. All I care about is what's true on the ground. That's where everything, all the spin stops, because when it runs into reality, reality is eventually going to win. This same report I mentioned to you a second ago about the problem with the maintenance, the Inspector General pointed out that was one of the big fundamental flaws with our operations in Afghanistan over the years, because we gave them all of this equipment, but they didn't have the capacity to keep it operating and maintain to sustain a long-term war. So the same problems we had in Afghanistan, we're repeating them here because we don't want to do things the right way. We don't want to take the amount of time. We just want a quick answer right now. So throw a bunch of vehicles into Ukraine and, a little bit of spare parts and hope that that'll work. Well, it's not going to. And by the way, Fiona Hill is supposed to be an expert on Russian, and she's making that comment there about how, we blinked in front of Putin, but her track record ain't exactly the best on being able to say she's an expert at Russia, because here's what she very confidently said at the start of this war.
And we are seeing now with the sanctions and the cutting off of Russia from the economy, a huge blow to the Russia that Putin has built up since 2000 in his period in the presidency. Russia is going to go into a very steep recession. Many of the gains that the Russian economy and the Russian population as a result made over the last 22 years, since the dislocations and the wrenching rapid deindustrialization of the 1990s, are going to be lost.
So she was this, expert on the Russia and the Russian economy and the Russian culture and way of life, and was very confident that the Russian economy was going to fall apart because of all the sanctions. Well, we know the exact opposite happened, and this was also, I think, very predictable. It wasn't as clear cut as the outcome on the battlefield, but it was predictable that Russia would make accommodations and that they would do things differently to change. And in fact, not only did they weather the sanctions, they actually increased their GDP 3.2%, I believe it was last year, while the entire West was below that, or in the case of Germany, in an outright recession. So that didn't work out too well. So you need to put a big asterisk when you hear comments like that from somebody with a big title, but they have a bad track record. Pay attention to that. We're about to see more of that. So also this weekend, you had Jake Sullivan go on television. And when asked point blank, can Ukraine actually win this war, despite everything that I've already told you, all the logic, he answers this way.
Of course, Ukraine can win. Of course, Ukraine has already succeeded militarily in one of the most profound objectives it had, which was to keep the country from falling into Russian hands. It has already done that. And Ukraine can go further in retaking territory that Russia has occupied, but it can only do so if it has the tools that it needs. And that is why the United States needs to deliver the aid package that passed on a massive bipartisan vote in the Senate. The House needs to step up and pass that bill.
See, this troubles me. This is the national security advisor to the president of the United States, the guy that the president leans on to be able to say in war and peace issues here, is this thing going to work? Is that thing going to work? How's this function? You know, what are the fundamentals that go underneath? The guy that's telling the president that, at least publicly, is saying things that make no sense at all in reality, because he's saying that, of course, they can win. Of course, they can, go back, but they need the tools. It's not the tools that are the problem. I've always said this from the beginning of this war. It's men, not machines. And it's definitely not cash. You can't just throw a bunch of money, dollar bills at the Russians. It's not going to change anything. You have to have a well-trained crew. You have to have equipment that's maintained and that's good and it's sustained over a long period of time. I mean, those are like the three fundamentals you can't get around. Ukraine has none of them. And because they don't have the manpower issue, the trained unit, especially at the multiple levels, and the experience that it has and the unit cohesion, they're never going to get that in this war. It's already too late, folks. You understand that? It doesn't matter how many guys they grab off the streets and throw in uniforms. They will never have that necessary component to be able to win. It don't matter how many tools we give them. As Jake said, it's never going to turn around. Yet that's what he's telling the American people. It's all about Congress passing this aid package. No, it's not. It's not going to make any difference because it won't affect that fundamental that I just told you about there. It's not even going to affect the ammunition and the machines. There's not just a bunch of that stuff sitting around everywhere. And if we just had some extra cash, we could go buy it, send it, forward and have it show up on the battlefield in a week or two. It just doesn't exist in anywhere that you can go purchase it. The places it does exist, the countries that have it, aren't willing to give up anymore because they already saw the thousands of vehicles that were given before made no difference. Why do they want to throw more of their equipment away for something that's also almost certainly going to fail? They're not going to, folks. Jake Sullivan should know that, but he continues to say the fiction here. Then we have Brother Hodges. So also recently, he's saying that, he was asked a similar question in a recent interview. Can Ukraine win? He had a slightly different view, but still the same outcome when he said this.
I think Ukraine is going to win this war, but not in 24. I think 2024 is the year before the decisive year. So this year is going to be about fixing the personnel system, building up industrial capabilities, continuing to chip away at Russia's logistics and chip away at the population. I just don't believe that the population of Russia is going to continue to accept the hundreds of thousands of casualties and the catastrophe that this war is for Russia.
Okay, just first of all, on the context of what he's saying right there, he's making a mistake that so many of these so-called experts in the West make, and that is he's only looking at half the equation. He's only looking at the Ukraine side, and that through rose-colored glasses. The Ukraine side is motivated, they're passionate, and certainly there's some truth to that. As I've said in a recent video here, the Ukraine side performed brilliantly in the first part of this war, but the sacrifices were very costly in what they accomplished back then, and it now costs them the manpower that they need right now to go any further than just slowing down the Russians, which is what happened in the first time. But he also fails to look at the other half of the equation. So while he's saying, we just need to hang on for 2024, then in 2025, that's when things will go on. They'll be chipping away at this. He's saying this as though Russia is a static entity. So whatever they are right now, that's what they're going to stay. So if you just chip away and make this weaker here, then by the time the Ukraine side has built up more combat power and more personnel they mobilized, bam, now then you can go against that weakened entity here. Unfortunately, that's not how reality works. Russia's not sitting still. To the contrary, they have been on a progressive upward arc for the better part of the last year, improving routinely. By the month, they get stronger. They're producing more artillery shells, more artillery weapons, more tanks, refurbishing more of their vehicles, repairing those off the battlefield, new entire classes of drones that they're bringing out, increasing missiles that now they're getting some from North Korea, some from Iran. They're producing more of their own. Some of these highly capable modern equipment. Everywhere you want to look, they're getting stronger. So while you're so-called chipping away with minimal long-range fires, the Russians are getting stronger, and they already have more of those long-range fires than the Ukraine side will ever get. So when you hear those kind of comments, if you don't hear him talk about both sides of that equation, then you can put a big asterisk on what he has to say. And when you look at his track record, like we did with Fiona Hill, then you'll see that Hodges has been wrong almost throughout this war in some profound ways, like this one from last year.
Ukraine will have been able to liberate Crimea if, and I've always included this caveat, if we provide them the long-range precision weapons that they need to do that. Yes, absolutely, they can do that.
Okay. Well, that's not what happened, because they did get their long-range missiles. First of all, it was obvious when he said that it just made my eyes roll, because I'm like, you can't be serious. You think that a few long-range missiles is going to change the outcome on the front line with all of those other fundamentals I told you about, especially in the offensive? Ukraine didn't have anywhere near enough air power. They didn't have anywhere near enough air defense, especially the air defense. They didn't have enough tanks. They didn't have enough of the right kind of tanks, and they had almost no breaching equipment, engineering equipment that's able to get through the minefields, the miles and miles and belts of minefields that the Russians had. All those things were the case there. A few long-range missiles, it would have been more painful for Russia. I mean, if you had those that you didn't have, it certainly anything you hit is going to be a problem for Russia, and they're not going to like it, and it's going to be painful. But it's not going to change the front line, and you don't need any more proof of that, because Russia does have all the long-range missiles. And has that caused the Ukraine side to collapse so far? They still are able to fight the front line. That can't be overstated enough. The same thing he claims that the Ukraine side needs to succeed, Russia has present tense, and they have throughout this war, and it has not made the decisive difference that he claims that it was going to make. So every way you look at it, he's just wrong, fundamentally so, and it's embarrassing that a former 3-star general who was the commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe still makes these fundamental errors that a second lieutenant shouldn't make. But he does, and people keep listening to him. Well, okay, so you say, okay, well, you say that first point there about lack of air power. The cavalry's coming, some want to say. F-16s are on the way. In fact, here's this rather optimistic report saying just that.
Despite harsh weather, time shortage, and the pressure to return to the fight, Ukrainian pilots and technicians are going through intense training at the Skrydstrup base in Denmark.
Well, combat experience is a thing that is really hard to overestimate, but still it is a really condensed program. I think the biggest boost here is not that combat experience, but the motivation to go back and keep fighting. It is really a super fun jet to fly. I'm not saying that MiG that I flew before is super boring, but the F-16 is definitely more agile. It feels like the jet wants you to fly it more aggressively.
So that sounds great. And I think elsewhere in there, they had some really motivational music, and it sounds cool because, man, F-16, that's an American fighter. That's the kind of thing that we use to dominate skies, and we've used in all these wars we've been fighting all the way back to Desert Storm and all the way forward, and it fears so many people. Problem is, there's a number of problems, but we get back to that same issue that I had with some of our other equipment that we give, that there is minimal amount of support. These planes are notoriously hard to keep in the air. They're much harder than some of the more rugged MiG fighters that the Ukraine side has been fighting. He makes the comment there that they're much more agile and nimble than the planes he's flying. That would be meaningful if there was a lot of dogfights that being the more nimble like they see on TV and a lot of the movies in the past. only there aren't any dogfights. I think there's been one dogfight in this entire war, which the Russian side won. And otherwise, it's long-range fires. And so the reason why the Ukraine side hasn't been able to engage much is because a great many of their ships were shot down early on, and they continue to try to fire them. They tried some of the locals, firing some of the local tactical fights. They got a lot of them shot down. When was the last time you even heard them flying anymore? You haven't heard anything, because when they get close to the front, they get shot down. Even the Russian jets have actually they've lost like 6 of them recently. But here's the thing, folks. There's nothing magic about an F-16, okay? And when this guy actually talks about it the first, that, well, it's been a very condensed program, and combat experience is very important in the air, more important than on the ground for that matter. That's the reason why we have years of training for our pilots before we ever let them go into combat. These folks they've taken the skills that they knew as a MiG pilot, which is very different, by the way. It's not, even though they're both planes and they're jets, they fly, the system behind them are very different. And so they have to learn a new system, not just the new language and the new capabilities. But an F-16 is vulnerable, folks, to the S-400 and the S-300s that the Russians have for air defense systems. They're not magic. One of the reasons it's so helpful in the U.S. Mission or often military is that it's part of an integrated system. It's got AWACS, it's got ground radars, it's got lots of means of communications and other links to various places. Things are all tied together. They don't have the whole system. They just have the one part there. And if that jet gets within range of the Russian air defense systems, it's going to get shot down like any other plane does. And that would even be with trained American pilots. They're concerned about Russian air defenses as well. So those things will come in, and they have more capacity than a MiG-29 does. So if they get into the air, they probably will have a little bit more success. But it's the same as with these long-range fires that the Ukraine side did get from Great Britain, especially with Storm Shadow. You remember that? That's why Hodges claimed that they had the long-range missiles, it would make a difference. But they got the long-range missiles. They just didn't get ours with the ATACMS. Though now apparently the White House is considering doing that. I don't know why they would think about it at this late year, at least late hour. But nevertheless, they did have them. They have lots of other missile systems too. They have lots of drones. So they had those capacities. It didn't make any difference. And with the F-16, even though those are more capable, it's marginally so. And there's going to be so few of them in number because there's so few pilots who can train to fly them. It's not going to make any difference on the ground. The things that are going to make any difference on the ground are what I've been telling you about the national military power, the manpower issue, the training issue, the sustainment issue. That's what's going to make a difference on the ground. All of this, folks, is not rocket science. You just have to be willing to look at the realities on the ground. That's the truth of all of this thing. So when I keep telling you Ukraine has no chance to win, it's not out of any spite toward the Ukrainian. In fact, I say often, and will repeat here again, I think I care more about the Ukrainian people than all of these advocates do. Because by listening to people like Fiona Hill, like Hodges, like Jake Sullivan, you're continuing to have this fiction that if we just keep supporting them, that suddenly they're going to change and they're going to win on the battlefield. And they're not going to. All they're going to do is keep dying because they desire to fight. They do, straight up, because their country was invaded. But by enabling somebody to do something that can't succeed, all you're doing is getting them killed. And ultimately, you're going to get more territory lost before a final negotiated settlement, like nearly all wars have some kind of negotiated settlement, ends this war. So it's going to cost them more. What we should be doing is recognizing the reality, recognizing all of those fundamentals that I keep mentioning over and over, and encourage Zelensky to make a deal or say, if you can do what you want, it is your country, it is your people, you have the call on that, but you'll do it without our stuff if you don't go after something that has a chance. That's necessary. That's necessary for Zelensky. It's necessary for his people. Somebody has to give them the tough love. Folks, if you care about Ukraine, you want to get this war over with as fast as possible, not keep going with fiction like everybody I just showed you. David Petraeus, add him to the list, and several others as well. Jack Keane, it's all fiction because it's not going to change on the battlefield. And that is your deep dive for today. Listen, folks, we're so grateful for you coming out here today. One of the reasons we're able to have this channel without charging folks or whatever is because of support that some of you give and by subscribing. So we ask you to, if you're watching this, subscribe to it. Keep sharing this with other people so more people get to the benefit of the same kind of level of analysis that you're getting here. Because I'm telling you, folks, you've seen it. You're not getting this on mainstream media. All you get is the quotes with no context, and you don't get all the other stuff that I've just added here. Share this with others so that they can get it, because, folks, we are honest on your side here. We're all in this together. And we are unintimidated here at this channel and uncompromised on bringing the truth, even when a lot of people don't like some of the things I'm saying. It's the truth, and you're going to get that here. We thank you very much. And by the way, join us tomorrow. We got a couple of good shows with Jason Beardsley at 11 a.m. And Tony Schaefer is going to be looking at some news you may have seen in the New York Times today about some real problems with our CIA and some things that have been going on in Ukraine that you didn't know about that our government tried to keep from us. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. You're not going to want to miss it. In the meantime, keep on keeping on, keep on watching this channel and sharing it with others. And we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.